For the past week and a half or so, I've been covering the Superbet Chess Classic. Now that was an absolutely fantastic tournament. It was Alireza Firouzja's return after 5.5 months away. I won't reveal who the winner was in case you want to catch up on the playlist. I'll link it at the end of the video. But now I want to take a look back at what's been going on in the world of chess during that time. And I'm starting here with a game that Magnus Carlsen played. So this was played in the Tuesday just gone, Tuesday 10th of May. Now he turned up for the chess.com titled Tuesday. So this is where only titled players can enter. They play blitz games, then you get a winner. It's $1,000 for the winner. Now Magnus never turns up for this event for the big reason that he plays on Chess24 when he does play. So he's a part owner in Chess24. That's a rival site of chess.com. And that's why, for example, Magnus doesn't play in the Speed Chess Championship anymore, which he played in a few years ago. So when he turned up, it got heads turning. You don't normally see this. And he absolutely destroyed the field in true World Championship style. He finished on 10 out of 11, only 2 draws. And one of those draws was in the final round when he'd already won. So, okay, he agreed a draw. But the game I want to look at here, he was playing against Grigoriy Oparin, a strong GM, 2685. He had the black pieces here, and let's see what happened. Brilliant game. So Oparin kicked off here with pawn to d4, and Magnus went pawn b6. So through the whole tournament, he was playing either b3 with white or b6 with black. We now had this knight coming to f3, bishop b7, pawn c4, and Magnus goes e6. He's setting up here this double fianchetto. So after g3 from Oparin, we had pawn g6, bishop g2, and bishop g7. So both of those ones now firing across the board, but white's of course got the centre here. So castles from Oparin, Magnus goes knight f6, knight c3, and now he hops this knight in on e4, immediately opens his bishop, makes life a bit more tricky as well for white to play the e4 move. Now you can play here with simply takes on e4, then after the bishop recaptures, you go bishop g5 as a possible follow-up move. This is actually a bit annoying, but Oparin actually plays to unbalance the position immediately because he's now giving up the bishop pair. So Magnus doesn't take immediately, he castles the king. Now queen c2 hits the knight again, so he forces Magnus's hand, he chops off that bishop, the queen recaptures, and now after pawn d6 from Magnus, Oparin goes e4. So although he's given the bishops, he's got the big centre. Okay, we've got an interesting game. Now the knight came to d7 from Magnus, this rook came to the d file, and now Magnus strikes with pawn c5, very thematic. Now Oparin didn't take that pawn on c5. If he did, then the knight would recapture here. And although it looks like you're just losing a pawn on d6, which you are, this isn't actually good for white because after the queen recaptures, rook takes, then you can pick up on e4. Now best is actually taking on c3 first. Yes, you give up the bishop, but you shatter the white pawns, then you pick up here, and this is just very good. The rook has to retreat, then you can see there's these long-term weaknesses on the c-file. Black is significantly better. So taking on c5 and then trying to pick up on d6 is no good. And if you take on c5 but don't take on d6, well then we'll get some stuff which is similar to what we see in the game. So takes on c5 wasn't played. We had queen e3 instead waiting. So Magnus took here, the knight recaptured, and now he went pawn a6. So he sets up this classic hedgehog formation with all the pawns on the 6th rank here, and it's a kind of coiled spring attack. You're waiting to see how white plays. White's got the Maroczy bind. You can't go d5 at the moment, but when the time is right, black often breaks with either pawn b5, d5, sometimes even f5 here. So a really interesting game. So rook d2 played, preparing to double on the half open file. Queen c7 hit the pawn, pawn b3 defended. This rook came to the c-file, rook f to d1. So Oparin wants to move this knight here, let's say to e2. Then he opens his rooks, attacks this pawn. So Magnus goes knight c5, and now if you go knight e2, this is really annoying. You're taking here with check. This isn't good for white. So the knight can't move at the moment. That's why knight a4 came, kicks this queen back, and now here Oparin could consider this knight e2 move, opening up the rooks, but again Magnus gets play for the pawn. So he could bring a rook to the d file, for example. If white crashes through, well, then there's this bishop c6 move. Now you're hitting this knight, you don't want black to take there, shatter the pawns, then the c4 pawn would be weak, not to mention the a4 pawn. So say you retreated the knight, well then there's the thematic pawn b5. Takes here, pawn recaptures, and you've got things like pawn b4 coming to kick the knight, clamp on these two pawns. Say you go a3 to prevent that, well then there's bishop to f8, you hit the rook, then you're picking back up your pawn. So once again, black's just getting loads of pressure for the pawn, should be in equal position when you know what you're doing. So that's why knight e2 wasn't played. Instead, Oparin tried to mix it up here. He went pawn to h4, but this isn't quite the right plan. So knight e2 was probably the best move, even though it was kind of level. So he goes h4, but this isn't so great. He's looking to attack the king, but all his pieces are playing in the center. They're not necessarily geared up for that plan. But okay, this is blitz. They're trying to mix it up. So here the rook came to d8 now. The pawn came to h5. And Magnus could already actually capture that one. It usually looks horrible to open your king like that, but in this position it's a bit more justified when white doesn't have all of those attacking pieces around the king just yet. But Magnus goes knight f6 first, and now Oparin maybe didn't like the look of knight g4, so he goes bishop f3, and now Magnus just snaps off that pawn. How does Oparin want to continue? Well, he goes knight to e2, looking to bring it into f4, opening up the rooks, but now Magnus gets his pawn b5 move. That knight just left d4, of course, so this is the counter shot. Really nice play. The pawn captured here, this one took back, and now best was actually coming back to c3, but here the knight hopped into b6, and although it looks aggressive, it's kind of pseudo-aggressive because it's not actually on an outpost there. Knights need outposts supported by pawns. Here it's a bit of a tactical liability. We can see that if this bishop ever moves, suddenly the knight's attacked. It's looking a bit shaky. So rook c1 was played, hit the queen. It came over to e7 here. This one also doubled on the file, looking to invade, but Magnus just ignores it. He goes pawn h4 here, now playing against the white king. The rook invaded and the queen dropped back to f8. So although Magnus has literally got all of his pieces on the back three ranks here, he's actually better in this position. It's kind of a coiled spring. He's like a cobra just waiting to pounce on the position. I love these hedgehog structures. They're so beautiful and aesthetically pleasing when they actually come off. So after this move, queen f8, here Oparin had to actually play something like queen to f4. Now this is a good move because we can see it just improves the scope of that queen, looks at these weak points, but instead of doing this, he went pawn g4, trying to keep the lines closed, but this is actually a blunder. So can you see the move to play here that punishes this tactically? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a future video. So here Magnus played bishop h6. So he's skewering the queen to the rook here, and this is just a straight up problem because after pawn g5, which was played, looks like white is now counter winning a minor piece. Well, queen g7 is the saving grace. The pawn is pinned to the king. Now here we had king h1, but it wasn't the best. Bishop g2 was actually best, not that you're necessarily going to find this, for the reason being that after you now capture the pawn, you can go pawn f4, the bishop moved out of the way of the pawn, and this is a bit better. However, after queen g7, king h1 was played, and now when captures happens, there's no pawn f4, so the queen moved away, that rook drops off, the other one recaptures. Magnus is an exchange ahead here. So he now brings his king to h8, there was a threat to go rook g1, and now queen e3 was played to take away this square of h6, then prepare rook g1 in a more favourable way. Plus when the queen lands here, it holds the knight on b6 some more. Now this rook came to g8, this one came to g1, Magnus ducks back to f8, and now the rook comes all the way back here. Oparin doesn't want to trade off his only rook, so he comes to d1, Magnus goes queen e7, and now this queen hits f4, pressures the pawn once again, but once again Magnus uncorks an awesome tactic. I referenced to it earlier, so he takes on e4 here, looks like he's losing a piece, but once again we've got this loose knight on b6. So f2 is hit, it's going to drop with check and a fork, so the bishop is pretty much forced to take there. This bishop recaptured with check, and now the queen took back, but you can't yet win this knight immediately. You do have to be careful. Then there's queen d4 check. After rook g7, you pick up a whole rook. So you can't yet win the knight, but the best move here for Magnus would have been queen to d8. And actually this knight has no squares to go to, as we can see. So best here is actually just giving it like this, ruining the pawn structure, but after a sequence like this, black should just be better, a matter of technique for Magnus. But he didn't find queen d8 here, instead he went queen to g5. Now this is an active move, still looks good, you're looking at these squares, but g2 and g1 are actually covered by pieces right now, so you're not immediately threatening mate. So Oparin has time to take on d6, hold the knight, and actually it's tricky for Magnus. Now the best here would seem to be bringing a rook to the d-file. What Magnus does is go pawn h3, looking to apply pressure here, maybe check on g2, the queen's come off, then the rook invades and looks in this direction, but it now gives white time to actually save this knight. So knight d7 was best here, you hit the rook, and now there's no time to start invading because then your rook's on prise at the end of the lines. Say you go rook to a8 here, well then there's queen d4 check. And you're pretty much forcing these queens off the board, and then it's anyone's guess really as to who's better in this endgame. It's very tense, very tight. But knight d7 wasn't played. Oparin got spooked here, so he drops his rook back to d1, but this just gives a whole knight. Now Magnus is really just clearly better here. So the knight came into g3, trying to block that g-file, but queen f6 was played, hits this f2 pawn, covers his own king from checks. So this queen came to e3, watch out for your rook on b6, it dropped back to b8, we had king h2, this one came to the d-file, rook g1 played, desperately trying to keep hope alive, but now rook d5, swinging into the game, the queen dropped back, and queen f4 was the final move. Both of those heavy pieces are converging on d2, the rook's coming down, everything's caving in, Oparin threw in the towel. So a dominant performance by Magnus, 10 out of 11, clear first prize. If you want to see another amazing game from him, click here. Thanks very much for watching, see you soon.